I'm recording. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Tobias, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure, and I'm really interested in your project on interaction. So I'm very happy to participate in it. You already mentioned some, Tobias, but just to talk a little bit, let you know something about what I'm going to talk about. So part of what I'm going to present today is published in this paper co-authored with my colleagues, Robert Klaus from my university and Paul Smart from the University of Southampton. And it's published in AI and Society. And I'm also going to present you towards the end my new project, which is more on interfaces, and the idea is so it builds on some of the ideas that we developed in this paper. And as you will see, this last part is more open and less elaborated, but I also have some open questions to you, and hopefully we have a nice discussion on this matter. So you've already been having different talks on interaction with intelligent systems, so I'm not saying anything new. And and also you live in this world, so you're familiar with interacting with AI systems. But I wanted to begin so that we enter in the conversation by telling you how, or by reminding you of how at an individual level, we interact with devices that have this kind of information processing and this kind of systems entrenched in them on a daily basis for many activities. So listening to music, knowing how to go somewhere. There is also an increasing use of AI technologies for affective needs, to monitor bodily reactions when doing sports, or even to monitor how many steps you take or how much you walk during your day. So on a daily basis, at an individual level, we interact with those systems frequently. And the trend we all guess is that it's gonna be happening more and more. So integration with those kind of systems is not gonna stop, but it's going to be even more pervasive as time progresses. But this does not only happen at an individual level, but also at a collective level. So very important life-changing decisions are taken on the basis of processes that rely on this kind of technologies. So whether it is to decide how many years someone goes to prison, or who gets parole, or who gets a job. So some of the first decisions are made on the basis of these technologies, giving rise to a lot of problems that nowadays are beginning to be more and more analyzed, concerning biases, for instance. But again, the situation is such that integration with AI systems is going to happen even more. Also in the healthcare, in healthcare, AI systems are going to play an even more important role. I was in a conference last month in Vienna. It was online, but there was a person presenting from that was involved in the European Union, and he was telling us about the budget dedicated in research and innovation to AI and healthcare. And I don't remember the amount, but it was like large quantities of money are being invested on the integration between AI and healthcare. So I think that this is something that is gonna happen more and more frequently. And just to tell you a little bit, I don't know how it is in Germany, but I recently I was in the US for the last 2 months, and there, in my insurance provider, one of the first steps, if I wanted to have any like healthcare, you had to go through you had to interact with an AI system first, and then they decided like what steps you should take next. So this is just to let you know, nothing new. I'm sure you all know this, but just to remind ourselves of the fact that a lot of collective decisions are being taken, or are gonna be taken even more, by systems that are partly intelligence systems, so systems endowed with this kind of information processing. And among this situation, we see a requirement that is widespread concerning more transparency. So here you have just a small excerpt from the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. I think it was of the European Union Commission. It was in 2019, and it didn't have any, well, the idea, this was not mandatory, but the idea is that artificial intelligence should be more transparent, and among transparency, we also found reference to human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being, and accountability. And among these requirements towards a more ethical artificial intelligence, transparency was an important one. So how is transparency defined? We don't find a specific definition, but in this document, just so that you have an excerpt, they said the following. So data systems and AI business models should be transparent. The idea is that they should have traceability mechanisms that can help achieve this transparency. Transparency is also related to explainability and the idea that humans need to be aware that they are interacting with an AI system and must be informed of the system's capabilities and limitations. So transparency is connected with explainability and with awareness and information. So yeah, this idea of more transparencies, more information, the idea that systems should be more open to discussion, the idea that AI should be explainable, should be questionable, AI should be such that people can understand it more, and overall the idea is to have more visibility. We don't, for now, all this sounds very well, but there are different ideas among what transparency is taken to mean. In our paper that some of you might have read before, the paper co-authored with Rob Klaus and Paul Smart, we call this type of transparency that is predominant in discussions on the ethics of AI, reflective transparency. In a few moments, I will tell you more about it, but there is also a different type of transparency that is connected to AI systems and is not so prevalent in these discussions. And as you will see, part of our work is vindicating that this type of transparency is also important and should also be considered when we are talking about interacting with AI systems, for the reasons that I will present in a moment. But this idea of transparency has to do more with transparent designs. The idea is that when interacting with an AI system or with a device that is endowed with this type of information processing and with this type of technologies, the user should not pay attention to the task, should pay attention to the task at hand, but not to the interface or not to the technology. And the idea is that experiences should be fluid, and transparency here evokes the idea of the technology or the interface in virtue of which we interact with a given app, for instance, disappears from our conscious experience, and we just enter the task that we are performing or enter the digital world without stopping at the interface or without stopping at the technology. So the interface is transparent, and there is this motto in user experience and user interface design that is becoming more and more common, and of which I will talk towards the end of this talk, that the best interface is the interface that disappears. So it's extremely transparent, so transparent that it's invisible almost. And we called this type of transparency, drawing from work also of from Richard Hersmink, who's here, and different authors within the extended cognition community. We called this type of transparency in use. I'm also referring to it as phenomenological transparency, perceptual transparency, but to be more consistent with the terminology used in that paper, here I will talk about it as transparency in use. The problem is that there seems to be a tension between both types of transparency. So while reflective transparency promotes or demands a kind of seeing into the mechanisms or different effects that technologies that interacting with an AI system have on ourselves, or different aspects of the technology itself, transparency in use entails seeing through, so not stopping at the technology, not stopping our attention, our conscious thought, our reflection in seeing, not stopping at some aspects of that technology. And there seems to be a tension because one type of transparency demands being able to reflect more, or being able to consciously encounter the mechanisms or the intelligent systems. Transparency in use evokes a different type of, or demands a different type of cognitive attitude, like not stopping. So we identified a potential source of tension, or a potential problem between those types of transparency, which we call the problem of transparency. And the question is, so are these two forms of transparency compatible? Are they incompatible? How do they relate to human agency? What should we prioritize when talking about designing more ethical AI systems? That for me right now, we can understand those as systems that promote our agency, not just systems where, well, systems that we can interact with in a more informed way and be more agents, not just passive users, but being agents while interacting with them. So we focused on that. What to do is reflective transparency, what we should prioritize, but what about transparency in use? And this is what I'm gonna talk to you about in the first 20 minutes, in the next 20 minutes, and then I'll say something about my current project, which has to do on how, which is connected to how to implement some of the ideas that I'm gonna present in a few moments. So the plan is the following. First, I'm going to present you the taxonomy that Klaus, Marta, and myself developed, which differentiates between different types of reflective transparency, which are subtypes, different ways in which we can reflectively access certain aspects of intelligent systems. Then I'll present in a bit more depth this idea of transparency in use. Then I will talk about how we think that both of them are important when considering how to design systems that enhance or support our agency. And then I will talk about my new project, which has to do with interfaces and with recent trends in user experience and user interface design. And I will connect these ideas of varieties of transparency and see how they can be applied in these current trends of design. Okay. So to begin with, artificial intelligence or intelligent systems and reflective transparency. As I just said, what we did in our paper, and I'm gonna present to you now, is different ways in which we can see into an intelligent system. So first of all, why reflective? Well, I've already talked about it, the idea of seeing into, the idea of opening a mechanism, the idea of being able to understand, the idea of being able to make a more informed decision concerning our interaction with them, seem to point out to making some of the constituents of an intelligent system open to further deliberation. So this is why we talk about reflective transparency. one way in which we can reflect or see into an artificial intelligence system is by what we call making it more informationally transparent, or by paying attention to its processing of information. So this is the type of transparency that has received most attention in the ethics of AI and adjacent discussions. And it refers to the disclosure of information about an AI system, typically for the purpose of prompting assessments about fairness, integrity, safety, efficacy, accountability, and compliance with regulatory frameworks. And this type of reflective transparency that we call informational transparency is important because it supports the formation and judgments and decisions regarding the suitability of a system for use within a given context. Depending on the context, different aspects of the information would be relevant. Typically, what is demanded is information about the nature of the algorithms using by a system, as well as the data used in training in a training regime. So all the work concerning biases would enter in this type of informational transparency. And in general, there are no strict rules regarding the type of information that must be disclosed in order to satisfy the demands for transparency. And in addition, the type of information will vary, as I just said, according to the type of evaluation and also according to the type of context of use. So what is interesting is that some forms, so the opposite of transparency would be opacity, right? So some forms of informational opacity happens because the systems itself are very difficult to analyze. So sometimes even developers are uncertain as the precise means by which some of the results were accomplished. So this reveals that informational transparency presents a major technical challenge sometimes. And some forms of opacity might not be intentional, but just a matter of how these technologies work. And our co-author, Paul Smart, would be able to explain this in much more, because he's a computer scientist, so he sometimes explained me about neural networks and genetic algorithms, and I'm sure he's able to explain why this poses a huge technical challenge. Well, a different type of reflective transparency, and a type that usually gets forgotten in discussions concerning the ethics of artificial intelligence, is what we have called material transparency. And this happens, we think that sometimes the digital nature of AI systems makes us forget their materiality. So and we think that when we demand reflective transparency, we also should take into account different aspects regarding their material realization. So this includes the materiality of hardware that performs a system, and as well as its production and or maintenance processes. And I was telling Tobias before that I have just written a review of a book published recently on Oxford University Press called Human-Centered AI. And the idea is how to make, it's a very interesting book on how to make artificial intelligence more human-centered so that they promote human autonomy and human agency. But reference to the materiality of AI systems was mostly missing. So I think that is a trend to forget the importance of the materiality of AI systems. And it's if we want AI systems to be transparent in this sense, this should also be a central part, in our opinion, of the discussion. And this has to do with, for instance, energy use, the ecological footprint, the different conditions that are that concern their manufacturing processes. And just to give you an example of a recent work that is reviewed by Karen Howe in the MIT Tech Review, I can share the link later in the chat. It has been argued that training some AI systems can emit as much carbon as 5 cars over their entire lifetimes. And I don't think that we are aware of these things when we are talking about making artificial intelligence more ethical, or when we are concerned on its suitability or its transparency. And this is why we thought that material transparency was one aspect of, an important aspect of reflective transparency. Also, there are a lot of inhumane conditions regarding the hardware and regarding the materiality of a lot of the materials that are the materials that make up a lot of the devices that we interact with. Okay, and the last type of reflective transparency is what we call a transformational transparency. And in this case, what our attention focused on was the idea of transparency regarding the bodily transformations that widespread use of smart devices or interacting with intelligent system causes. And sometimes this information is not known, and we think that in order to render those systems transparent, we should also encourage research towards this direction. So what is the effect that interacting with those systems have on our cognition? And when those effects are hidden, that would cause what we call something like transformational opacity. But transformational transparency would be focused on being more aware of the effect that that pervasive interaction has on our bodies, on our cognitive systems, on our cognitive abilities. I really like a paper written by Richard Hersmick and Alex Gillette on GPS, and there they mention some of the effects that that interacting with GPS have on our navigational abilities. This is not to say that all the effects are going to be negative, not at all, but we should be aware of the effects that, or at least when we demand transparency, we think that this is an important dimension. So how is this affecting? There's also, currently, I think we're getting more and more aware of the effect that it has on our attentional spans, but it can change our abilities in different ways. And if we want AI systems that are more transparent, we think that also research should be directed towards that, so that at least we can make individually and collectively more informed decisions. So in short, reflective transparency points to the invisibility or the invisibility of certain informational or material aspects of smart devices and our interactions with them, as well as the invisibility or visibility of the effects that their widespread use causes in their users. Okay, so Tobias, could you let me know when I have 10 more minutes so that I'm aware? Okay, so now to present to you the other type of transparency that I introduced at the beginning. So it has its origins in phenomenology and the philosophies of technology, mind, and cognitive science. I guess that most of you are familiar with this notion, and the idea is it was introduced when talking about how we manage to act while interacting with different tools or with different artifacts. And transparency, as I said at the beginning, evokes the idea of not stopping at the interface. For instance, in a simple technology or artifact such as a pen, the idea is that when I'm writing, I don't stop here at the interface where I'm coming into contact with my pen, but I act. So this notion has been also applied to different kinds of technologies, including technologies and with artificial intelligence. So I guess that you're all familiar with this idea, but when talking about transparency in use, always the notion of incorporation and body schema shows up. How to define the body schema is a debate on its own, but it has usually been argued that after extensive interaction with a given technology or with a given tool, The personal representation, and I know that even talking about representation is contested, but is transformed, is modified. And when that happens, it is usually interpreted as the idea that the tool has been incorporated into the body schema, into the representation of the personal space in the brain. Now, this notion of transparency, as I said, has been taken up also in user interface design and user experience design. And the idea is that we should design transparent interfaces where interaction is fluid, where interaction is easy, and basically where you don't stop at the interface. And when you don't stop, we could say that that system has been integrated or is an indicator of a certain integration or incorporation. Probably not a necessary condition, but it's usually taken to, that this phenomenological transparency entails pervasive use or entails that you're familiar basically with that in that system and that you can easily interact with it. So transparency in use in this kind of systems usually entails the development of certain skills. If it's an informational resource, an informational device, you would probably need to develop certain interpretational skills, but also certain sensory motor skills that allow you to fluidly or easily manipulate and interact with such system. Okay, and now I've presented you both types of transparency with the different subtypes of reflective transparency. And now let me go back to the transparency problem. So as I introduced at the beginning, if just from a quick look, or if we think about both types of transparency, it seems that they have little to do with each other, and they can even be in tension, because while one, reflective transparency, demands an increased visibility or an openness to cognition, it tells us it demands a certain possibility of stopping and reflecting and thinking and understanding and being aware of certain aspects of the technology. Transparency in use seems to demand the opposite. Like, do not stop, just go with the flow and act and enter, in this case, the digital world without your conscious thought interrupting or making your interaction less fluid. So it seems that there could be potentially intention. Well, for the reasons that I just say, I don't want to read through these bullet points. You can if you want, but while one demands more reflection, the other one seems to render reflection more difficult, because the idea is, let's design systems in such a way that you don't stop and think, you just act. So this is, in a nutshell, the problem of transparency. Now, it is true that, imagine that you're interacting with a certain, I don't know, with a GPS, and you want to arrive at a destination, and the system is designed in such a way that reflective transparency is that it is highly reflective transparent. It is constantly telling you how it works. It is constantly giving you information or making information open to you. It's true that it seems, at least just if we quickly think about it, that a high degree of reflective transparency can sometimes be an obstacle for a fluent interaction with that system. On the other hand, if a system is not at all transparent in use, and it's very, very hard to interact with it, it's very hard to understand how to manipulate the interface, our action is also diminished. So in our work, we try to understand how these two notions of transparency relate to one another, and how do they relate with how we act, basically, with our agency. I'm gonna miss that previous slide. So the hypothesis and then the proposal that we develop is that both types of transparency have an important relationship to our agency, which, just for the sake of simplicity, we define as the exercise or manifestation of the ability to act or do things. And the question that we asked ourselves is, what is the appropriate type of transparency in a given circumstance, and how do they relate to one another, and what should we prioritize? And in order to answer, we delve into some aspects of the structure of human agency, and we differentiate, mainly drawing on paradigmatic work on agency by Bradman, on basic forms of agency, and more complex forms, what we call strong agency. Okay, so just to finish this proposal, and then I'll say some words on my new project, which is, okay, but then how do we materialize these ideas in design? So it seems that we can differentiate this idea of basic agency, which points to the activity, to the ability to act, to carry out an action, and we can contrast it with a stronger form of agency, which points to an agent's capacity for reflection, self-assessment, self-regulation, and more importantly, organization with respect to long-term projects. So we have this more basic agency, which can be more immediate. How do I interact here and now with a given technology and carry out an action? And then we have this other capacity to reflect, to act according to plans, more diachronically extended plans, self-regulate our abilities, and self-assess our long-term projects. So the crucial thing is that it seems that currently the trend is to design smart devices that are more transparent in use and less reflectively transparent. So, and later I will have an example with Google Maps, and hopefully this will become more clear. So I have already said this, and I want to go towards the end. Okay, yeah, as I was saying right now, the idea or something, and if you have questions on this matter, I'm happy to talk about this at the end. It seems that systems are more designed to be more transparent in use, as I said, and less reflectively transparent. And one of our key points in that work was that enhancing our strong agency requires higher degrees of reflective transparency, but basic agency requires transparency in use. Just to follow up on the example I previously mentioned, if we have a technology that is very, very complicated to interact with, that we really need to figure out how to understand the interface, how to communicate with it, which it all happens through the interface, then our capacity to act in virtue of our interaction with it is diminished. So in principle, it seems that reflective transparency is more connected with stronger forms of agency, and transparency in use is connected to basic forms of agency, with the capacity to actually act in virtue of our interaction with those systems. So one of the examples that we analyze is this interacting with a GPS. And as I said previously, it is a challenge how to combine both forms of transparency in design, precisely because of the reasons I previously mentioned. Imagine at an individual level that you're trying to reach a destination and the system is highly reflectively transparent. It has to be so in a way that it doesn't disrupt your capacity to actually reach your destination in the case of a map, because if it's open to reflection in such a way that it is constantly interrupting you, for instance, then your basic agency, which in this case would be your capacity to reach your destination, would be disrupted, allegedly. I think it all boils down to good design, and this is something I'll talk towards the end. But it is a challenge how to make both types of transparency, how to implement both types of transparency in systems. So just to wrap up some of the ideas that I have just mentioned, it seems that at least from a first analysis, basic agency is more connected with transparency in use, while a strong agency is more connected with reflective transparency, but both of them are necessary for interacting with AI systems. Okay, I have already said that talking freely, so I don't want to go through these bullet points. If any of you wants my PowerPoint, I'm happy to share my slides with you later. But our proposal is that all types of transparency are necessary, and that contrarily to one might have thought, making the challenge is how to implement both types of transparency in designs, but both of them play an important role in human agency, whether it's its basic forms or its strong forms. And it's definitely a challenge in design, but making systems that are highly reflectively accessible, but highly but not transparent in use would diminish our capacity of interact with them. And we also think that making systems that are highly transparent in use but very reflectively opaque harms our agency. So our recommendation was to design systems that afford both types of transparency. So while transparency in use, some degree of transparency in use is required for a fluid interaction with technologies, reflective transparency, as I said, seems to be key for stronger forms of agency. And the current situation is, I think that at least in user experience and user interface design, is leading towards designing systems that are more and more transparent in use. And this is good in a sense because it allows us to interact with them, but there are also a lot of challenges or a lot of risks of that, because it makes stopping at the interface, reflecting on what is going on, more complicated, precisely because of this seamless, fluid interaction. And if I have time, I'll play a video at the end of design, and otherwise I'll, okay, perfect, 10 minutes, so good timing. Okay, so this was our project, and now I'm working on a project which I'm calling Experiencing the Interface, and I'm working on how to make these two types of transparency, of course, at a conceptual level. I'm not a designer, but I'm trying to analyze different trends in user experience and user interface design, seeing how the mind is described in some of the guidelines that designers and developers use, and seeing how could we interact fluidly with that technology while at the same time reflecting, being able to reflect, to stop, to have a more conscious encounter with that technology or that system. So yeah, how can intelligent systems or devices be transparent in both senses, and how can we increase our agency when interacting with such systems? Something that I don't know if I've made sufficiently clear, but is the idea that transparency is a relational category. So it connects a user or an agent, in this case a human, with a given technology, and it relates the skills of the user, the agent, or collective groups with a given technology. So it's, on one hand, it requires the development of certain skills and also certain designs, so that there is this relation between them, whether it's the capacity to understand, to reflect, or whether it's the capacity to interact with them. So transparency points to this relation between these two, between human and computer, basically. And that means that depending on our embodiment, depending on our abilities, a system will be more or less transparent. So it's not an all or nothing phenomenon. Maybe I interact with a system and it's highly transparent in use for me, but it is not for a person with different abilities. Or maybe an algorithm is highly reflectively transparent to my colleague, Paul Smart, but given my abilities, it's fairly opaque to me. So this is just to add an additional layer of complexity, that transparency is relational, and a system will be transparent for some and opaque for others. And so it adds a different layer of complexity when thinking about how to implement both types of transparency in a system, because in a way it will change depending on who's using it or who's interacting with such system. But just my current idea is that in order to implement both types of transparency in these systems, designing good interfaces is a key element of it, and technological literacy. So developing skills that allow us to understand in a bit, understand more what is it, how technologies work, or what is the kind of technology that we are interacting with, how do they work. And given the role, and this connects with what with the beginning of my presentation. So if we reflect on the role that AI systems have on our lives at an individual and at a collective level, more technological pedagogy and increasing our technological skills, I think is important for the conversation towards a more ethical AI, or for designing and building more AI systems. So it's a combination of good design and technological literacy. So just in the last 5 minutes, I will briefly present these ideas, which are my current work in progress, and then I'll conclude with some open questions, and maybe that gets the conversation started, or if you have other questions, I'll be happy to address them as well. So I'm not gonna, well, an interface, you already know, it's the point of contact, and in this case is what enables communication between a human and a computer. And I've been reading the Apple Human Interface Guidelines, and different guidelines that developers use. And this is some of the ideas that we find. So they say define custom gestures only when necessary. People might find it difficult to discover and remember a custom gesture, and if it's awkward to perform, people may not want or be able to use it. If you decide to define a custom gesture, make sure it's easy to discover and perform. So here we see transparency in use, and as I told you, the trend is making technologies that are highly transparent in use. Nowadays, we see, and people are talking more and more about this idea of intuitive interfaces that you don't need to stop and figure out how they work, but they are just intuitive. They don't specify what they mean by that, but it's the opposite of reflecting. It's just some of them are based on a human-to-human interaction, and the idea is that they should be fairly easy to figure out, basically. One of the main books by Golden Krishna, he worked at Google, is The Best Interface is No Interface. So we are going from transparent to no interfaces. You are the only interface you need, touch less, do more. So intuitive interfaces are reaching the point of disappearing. So they are so intuitive that you don't even notice them. And that has some benefits. And some of the benefits are also accessibility, but there are also some challenges, and the challenges have to do with reflective transparency with the capacity to actually stop, consciously encounter the technology and knowing that you're interacting with a technology. I should stop, right? Or can I? Okay, if I have time, then I'll play. Well, I'll do it now because I wanna, so that you know a little bit what I'm talking about. Can you see this, my video now?
I think you might have to change what you share.
Yeah, I think I need to change it. 1 second. I'm gonna stop sharing and choose. Okay. Now you can, right? Oh.
Today, computers are everywhere, but the more devices we have, the more overwhelming it can get. So the Advanced Technology and Projects team, Google, is rethinking how we interact with computers by using solely rendered technology and advanced machine learning to create ambient, socially intelligent devices that are controlled by a wave of a hand or turn of the hand.
We are inspired by how people interact with one another. As humans, we understand each other intuitively, without saying a single word. We pick up on social cues, subtle gestures that we innately understand and react to. What if computers understood us this way?
This is where solid data technology comes in.
Where we don't need to see everything, but so the idea of the best interface is no interface, or the idea of rendering interfaces more and more transparent to the point of invisibility is happening, and either saying that it's going to be well, it's already, I think, one of the main trends, and as you can already suspect, if we are not even aware that we are interacting with a technology, or if a technology gets activated by itself without ourselves noticing the interface, then this poses a challenge for reflectively accessing certain aspects of the technology or of our interaction with it. And just to finish with, because I have more ideas, but I prefer to stop. So I have more slides, but I prefer to stop in the discussion. And if we have time, then I'll go over them. But just to mention a chapter, one situation that Golden Krishna mentions in his book, The Best Interface is No Interface. So he reviews a case of a good design, according to him, in which you are, imagine that you are, you usually go to a certain cafeteria to order your coffee, and you have a certain app in your smartphone. The cafeteria also has that technology, and you arrive there, and automatically your order, if you always order the same thing, for instance, the waitress prepares the coffee or your drink without you having to actually order it, or without you actually having to pay, because it all takes care automatically. And allegedly it is to promote human interaction. I guess that you could also do that without any technology, just ordering your coffee and talking to the waiter or waitress. But the idea is that it all happens in such a way that the technology is taking care of itself, and you are not stopping at the interface. So some ideas are, so constantly checking your phone, for instance, is very disruptive. But if we push it too hard to the point that interfaces disappear from our conscious experience, and from our experience in general, there are some risks, and I'm currently looking at it. I'm reviewing how conscious thought is understood and what do they mean by intuitive. And I think that consciousness does not necessarily need to be disruptive. And I think there's a misleading way of understanding the role of conscious in skillful action. And this is been going on for a long time. And there are researchers, including myself, that we are trying to show that conscious thought doesn't need to be disruptive, and there's a way of what I'm calling consciously encounter the technology without your consciousness being disruptive. And I think that could be a way of changing this idea that reflection is incompatible with a fluid experience. And also I'm trying to analyze not only the benefits that this idea of intuitive interfaces have, which it can, depending on certain sensory motor skills for interacting with a technology, can be exclusionary, and it can and having more different types of interfaces is always a good thing for accessibility. But there are also risks of the disappearance of the interface, basically, and they have to do with other aspects of unreflective human-computer interaction, so higher dependence, commercial interests, not being able to reflectively engage with a technology, and as to connect it with some of our previous discussion, this harms our agency and our strong forms of agency. So it's important, I think, that we find the correct balance between fluid experiences, but also conscious experiences. And well, I knew that there were going to be some students here, and to all the audience, I wanted to know what are your thoughts on interfaces, if you prefer to notice a technology or not, if you think transparency is important, and if you have reflected on your interactions with smart technologies. And some people might think, look, I really don't want to know that I'm interacting with a technology. I know we can be very heterodox. And I wanted to finish with these open questions. And thank you for listening.